history classrooms.
So just focusing on the seven myths,
Yeah.
Seven myths of the Crusades
Sure.
that came out in 2015, what issues do you take on? What are the kind of most important
Sure.
contributions do you think that work ultimately makes?
Well, with the seven myths that we have here, and I have it open to the table of contents here, just to make sure I don't slip, we recruited Paul F. Crawford, a wonderful Crusade historian. Most Americans will have seen him on the History Channel or Discovery Channel or various specials. He's appeared in a number of television programs on the Crusades, and he wrote the first chapter, which has to do with the myth that the Crusaders, attack a peaceful Muslim world. The actual title of his chapter is The First Crusade, Unprovoked Defense or Overdue Defense. And this is perhaps the most controversial of all the chapters in the book and has been received that way in some ways. But what Paul was pointing out is something that Crusade historians have long known, is that, the Crusaders, when they go off to the Holy Land, it's in large part because Eastern Christians are asking them for help. Pope Gregory VII, 20 years earlier, had considered a sort of proto-crusade where he called on 50,000 Western knights to go to the aid of Eastern Christians. This was the way they had framed it. And Peter Frankopan at Oxford University has recently published a book really highlighting these extensive efforts on the part of Eastern Christians to recruit Western military aid. And so there's a lot going on in the 20 years or so before the First Crusade is called. Christian cities like Nicaea, where the great Christian church councils were held in the 4th and 8th centuries. Christian cities like Antioch, where Christians first got the title Christian, was bestowed on them as a form of derision. These are cities that are conquered in the 1080s. And so there's this sort of outcry from the East, and much of it's very propagandistic in the way it's framed, really extraordinary claims, and it's meant to stir up sympathy in the West. And whether all those claims are, 100% defensible is debated sometimes, but nevertheless, scholars like Frankopan and others, and Andrew Jatishki and some others think that there's real legitimacy, And so Crawford points this out. It's not just a bunch of sort of zealous, mad crusaders that march off to the Holy Land in pursuit of, a sort of fanatic glory or something. In fact, they take, which delves into the second myth, James Muldoon's. There's a lot of planning, a lot of thought. There's a development of canon law to justify crusading. And so these aren't just sort of frenzied madmen that are rushing off to war with real religious zealotry. They're waiting for crops to come in, before they leave, and in most cases. And so Jim Muldoon picks up on that theme, Madmen on Crusade, Religious Madness and the Origins of the First Crusade. And he considers very carefully the rationality of the Crusaders, and he dispels a lot of these sort of popular assumptions about these things. The third chapter is by a friend of mine, Daniel Frank, a talented military historian who was teaching at West Point for a few years before he's recently settled in to a new college, to a tenure track position. The Crusades and medieval anti-Judaism, cause or consequence. And he takes what he calls a triangular approach to this issue, because during the First Crusade, some of the worst violence against Jews took place in medieval European history. These attacks, there was some crusaders who had set out early, had attacked Jewish communities in the Rhineland and elsewhere, and their rationale seems to have effectively been, if we're going to fight the infidels in the Holy Land, maybe we should fight them at home, But this wasn't sanctioned, of course. It's not like the Pope said anything about attacking Jews. And in fact, many Crusade leaders, secular leaders, the emperor at the time, the Pope at the time, were upset with these attacks. They saw them as diversions. In other words, Crusades weren't about, or weren't supposed to be, at least from the top down, about attacking Jews. But some critics will argue that the excitement, the enthusiasm of the crusading era contributes to this. It stirs this up. And so Daniel Frank takes a very measured look at these complex issues, and he triangulates, as he puts it. He takes three positions on this, and he triangulates to see, to arrive at what he feels are, very reasonable conclusions, what we can say and can't say about this. Number 4, The Quest for Gain, were the First Crusaders Proto-Colonists by Corliss Slack. And Corliss is a wonderful historian who looked at this issue. To what degree did economic gain factor into the Crusaders' motivations? Were they colonists? Because they do set up Crusader states, four major states with the First Crusade. And she rejects some of these popular assumptions about this. I mean, you know, the Crusaders aren't 19th century imperialists in any modern sense of the term. The Crusader states were massively expensive. They were depopulated. Scholars like Christopher McKeevick at Dartmouth University have pointed out how they even ruled with a certain, as he calls it, rough tolerance, because they were so anxious to make sure their states were populated. You know, how can you rule a Crusader state if nobody lives there, right? And so they had large populations of Muslims and Jews and Eastern Christians and others. And so it's a very different type of scenario, you know, and most historians today have sort of rejected associations with modern colonialism. But correct me if you, because you know these arguments well, David, and this is a short interview, and if I overstep, don't be shy about coming in. But something else Corliss looks at also is the notion that material gain is what drove the Crusaders, and she once again goes back to the same arguments that I mentioned earlier about Riley Smith and the charters. One historian, John Francis, estimated that on the First Crusade there was a 75% casualty rate. It was entirely voluntary, and these were people who knew the hardships of crusading. If you've got to walk on foot across continents and fight armies all the way through and fund it all yourself and have your mom mortgage your house to do it, this isn't an easy thing, to do. And it bankrupted many crusaders, and it caused great financial havoc. And that's the one thing they're stressed out about in their charters is the costs of crusading.
Put all of their affairs in order.
Exactly. And so a lot of property has to be accounted for, mortgaged, pawned, I guess, and so on, or sold. Yeah. And then of course the fifth myth is one. I wonder who wrote the fifth one. Maybe you could remind me. Was that?
I think I might have contributed to that.
I think that's right. It was David Sheffler, chair of the history department at the University of North Florida. A wonderful essay on the Children's Crusade. What was the Children's Crusade? I love how you began your essay, because you start with a survey of your students in your class, and you ask them what was the Children's Crusade, and one responded along the lines of, isn't that the Kids' Crusade where they all got killed, or something like that. And this has been a topic of derision of the Crusaders for a long time, because particularly, I suppose, in the Enlightenment and post the Reformation.
Voltaire was particularly critical of this aspect.
Absolutely, you're the expert, so yeah. But this idea that the Crusades were so terrible that they sent their kids off, and they all get enslaved in North Africa or whatever the case, And but it's much more complex than that. A lot of it is probably literary. There's some issue about the actual age of the Children's Crusade. I realize that scholars have decided they definitely were younger, as you point out. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're 6-year-olds, right? I mean, this could be. So there's different ways of interpreting this. But it's a fascinating chapter, and I encourage everyone to read it. I'm sitting here taking so long. The Templars and Masons, An Origin Myth by Jace Stuckey, another Crusade historian who studied under my advisor, Florin Curta. Jace writes about the Templars, and there's few people, there's few organizations that more conspiracy theories swirl around than the Templars. Umberto Eco, I think, famously said that you can tell a madman by the fact that he eventually brings up the Templars, and whether it's the free...
Or an undergraduate student, actually.
Or an undergraduate student, yes, you're right. But from the Freemasons claiming a lineage with the Templars to Dan Brown novels and these elaborate stories of the Templars, Jace takes on a lot of these myths and just argues that it's all myth, that there just isn't any historical connection between these different groups. And then finally, one of the most controversial chapters, perhaps second after Paul Crawford's, is the one by Edward Peters at the University of Pennsylvania, retired professor emeritus, and his former graduate student, Mona Hamad, who teaches in Jordan, and they looked at the modern Muslim memory of the Crusades. how do modern Muslims understand the Crusades as a historical event? And in large part, it's seen as a period of victimization, where Westerners were traveling to the Holy Land and inflicting all this violence on them. And but they point out very clearly that that's largely an invented memory that begins in the late 19th, early 20th century, really, in an age of modern imperialism, when the Western world is active in the Middle East. You see Ottoman leaders, for example, making comparisons of their plight with, events in the 12th century, and so on, and that most Muslim histories could care less about the Crusades, because historically there was a triumphalist view of history of the Muslim past. In other words, perhaps 2/3 of the Christian world, for example, is conquered by Muslim armies prior to the First Crusade. Then you have a 2-century period of crusading, but then after that you have the Ottoman push into Europe. And so there's a lot of military success, or from the point of view of some Muslim writers, military glory, even, as there's all these conquests and victories. And yet inserted right in the middle of it is these Crusades, And so a lot of these histories would gloss right over the Crusades. But then in the 19th and early 20th century, at a time of weakness in the Islamic world,
In terms of politics.
In terms of politics, and also there's Western European colonial powers that are inserting themselves in these affairs and so on. There's a new narrative that emerges that the Crusades are the beginning of this sort of thing, without addressing, Islamic imperialism, which existed on a pretty large scale in the Middle Ages and early modern period. And so, anyways, Dr. Peters and Dr. Hamad look at modern sources. Dr. Hamad knows Arabic fluently, of course, and they write a fascinating chapter about the invention of this modern Muslim memory of the Crusades. So anyways, that's a mouthful. But we cover a whole host of other myths in the introduction, and you can imagine this is a complex book, and we're trying to keep it all, each chapter short and digestible, 20 pages roughly each, so that undergrads who don't have this background can come in and read this and understand, what the historiographical arguments are, where they're at currently. And so that was the goal.